Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2 version 3, where we will be introducing the draft version of the standard and going through some of the proposed changes tentatively based on the draft that has been released so far. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. The agenda for today's presentation you can see on the screen. We will talk a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We will go through some of the general benefits of certification for a standard like R2. We'll discuss the tentative transition information as far as has been released to date. We will go through revision information, some key changes, some other revisions related to the changes that we know about so far. And again, all of this is tentative at this point. And we will close the presentation with an overview of the certification process for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time instead of transitioning from R2 2013 to R2 version 3. And we will close with any questions. So at any point during the presentation, you can go ahead and type those questions into the chat field, but I will be saving them for the end. PJR is one of the leading registrars. This list is not all-inclusive, but gives you an idea of some of the countries where PJR has certified companies to a wide variety of standards. We are accredited to grant certification for various standards, including R2, which is what we are discussing this morning. At a high level, benefits of certification include, but may not be limited to, being able to advertise a commitment to responsible reuse and recycling of electronics, obviously, which is what the standard itself represents. So by maintaining certification to R2, you are maintaining that commitment to responsibly recycling electronics and ideally reusing them. Improvements to your organization's environmental health and safety performance go hand in hand with maintaining the requirements of the standard. It represents a framework for identifying and meeting both customer and regulatory requirements as you go through various requirements within the standard. There is improvements or benefits associated with management commitment, leadership, as well as employee engagement. Maintaining certifications like R2 may provide a competitive advantage and/or an improved public image, being able to advertise a certification like R2 and what it represents. There may be potential financial benefits associated with that competitive advantage, improvements to public image, or otherwise. Achieving strategic objectives or stakeholder requirements may be streamlined as you go through the process of maintaining a certification like R2. Sometimes there's some overlap there. And the ease of integration with other business management systems would be another benefit to certification. In terms of the transition timeline for R2 version 3, currently the status is that the standard draft has been released, and I've included a link where you can, someone raised their hand here. If you can save questions for the end, and if your hand is raised, just go ahead and type your question in as well. I accidentally clicked on the question, which means I won't see it later. Let me quick answer this one, and then we will get back to the presentation. ISO 45001 is not listed on the accreditation list. We are currently going through the process of getting accredited. At the time of this webinar, when I last revised the slides, we were not accredited. I'd have to double check on our status We are going through the process of achieving accreditation, and we are conducting audits to this standard. Once we achieve accreditation, if we haven't already, we will be able to issue accredited certificates. So that is something that we are currently auditing to and actively in the process of pursuing. Okay. So I've included a link on this slide for where the draft version can be downloaded. If you haven't reviewed that already, there is a public comment review period going on. The revised draft is expected sometime later this fall based on those public comments. The final version of R2 version 3 is expected early in 2020, and this may change. Revised versions of the Code of Practices and the R2 guidance document will also be released after R2v3 is published in its final form. An exact timeline of those releases has not yet been confirmed, and we will keep updating these slides as we have new information. This webinar will be offered on probably a every other month basis, and we will keep updating it as we learn more. There will be time for certification body auditors to transition once the revised standard is available. That's been built into the transition process so that audits can be conducted to R2 version 3 in a timely manner once the standard is released. I believe training may even begin before the final version is released based on the expected changes, and then if we need update training, then that will be conducted. But again, we'll continue to revise these slides as more information is available. So I have a rough timeline. A tentative transition plan has been released by CIRI. Again, that's subject to change. All certification bodies like PJR will be required to obtain accreditation to R2v3 before accredited certificates can be issued. I will keep the slides updated to that end as well. Let's see, PJR will issue a transition plan after they've been formalized by CIRI and the final version published. PJR may communicate an internal deadline by which transition audits must occur in order to prevent a lapse in certification. This would be done to ensure sufficient time for corrective action responses, certification review and decision activities, in-house by PJR, things like that. And that would come, again, after the publication of the final version of the standard. Based on the tentative transition plan released by CIRI, for facilities pursuing initial certification to R2 2013, will have 6 months after the release of R2v3 to complete their stage 2 audit. After that deadline, we won't be able to conduct registration audits to R2 2013 anymore. So keep an eye on that publication date to make plans accordingly. If you are pursuing certification for the first time, but you've already created your documents to R2 2013, you'll need to go ahead and complete that stage 2 audit within 6 months of R2v3's release. For companies or organizations who are already certified to R2 2013, your transition timeline will be based on your certificate expiration. So if the certificate expires within 12 months of the release of R2v3, then you can get recertified to R2 2013, but your certificate expiration date will reflect 3 years or this deadline of December 31st, 2022, whichever comes first, because this is the deadline by which everyone needs to transition to R2v3. Or if your certificate expires after 12 months of R2v3's release, then you'll need to upgrade to R2v3 during your next recertification audit. as long as the final transition can be completed again by this deadline. So we'll look at these on a case-by-case basis as you're scheduling. Your scheduler can work with you on this as well, but the overall deadline to transition is December 31st, 2022. So keep that in mind as you are moving forward. This staggered transition plan will help certification bodies not get overloaded with a high volume of facilities trying to transition all at once. And it gives you at least a year to plan for that transition. I've put this tentative timeline together based on that information. Sometimes the visual is helpful. Again, this is all subject to change. Early 2020, we're looking for the publication of the standard. PJR plans to train their auditors in December based on the draft and begin auditing to the standard after it's released. We won't be able to issue accredited certifications until we obtain our accreditation, obviously. Let's see, 6-month deadline for not completing any more R2 2013 registration audits, so that's something to keep in mind. These dates are subject to change, as I mentioned. Then we've got the 12-month expiration requirement to upgrade to R2 V3, and then the overall deadline, December 31st, 2022. Again, this is what we discussed on the previous slides, just put into a timeline. After December 31st, 2022, all R2 2013 certificates will automatically become obsolete. Okay, that's a lot of information, and these slides will be made available after the presentation to download. You can download them through PJR's website to be able to go back and reference this information. So we'll get back on track with the transition and the revised standard itself. Why was R2 2013 revised? There are a wide variety of reasons why a standard might be revised. Specifically, R2 2013 was revised to take into account lessons learned by SERI, feedback from the R2 Technical Advisory Committee, the TAC, as well as public comments. That might include customers, auditors, certification bodies, etc. Reflect diversity in the industry is another reason for revision. Reinforcing effective implementation of the standard requirements and ensuring the intent is achieved. Clarifying language in the standard or any sources of confusion. Ensuring market relevance, compatibility with other standards or management systems, ensuring ease of use and implementation, provide inclusive coverage to a wide range of sectors and industries, company sizes, and to be free of ambiguity, so making it easy to understand, translate, etc. Okay. No changes have been made to the intent of the R2 standard, but we will look at some of the key changes in R2 V3 tentatively based on the draft. Obviously, these slides will be changed once the draft is revised and once we have gone through our auditor training as well. So this is just based on our preliminary review of the R2 V3 draft. The standard has been divided into core requirements and process requirements. So that's a very significant change to the format of the standard. Process requirements are found within the appendices, and all process requirements applicable to the R2 facility's scope must be included in the R2 certification. Overall, there's a greater emphasis on reuse with an increase in how prescriptive the requirements are on the specific topics of data security, testing, and repair processes. There is clarification of requirements which were not understood or were ineffectively implemented in previous versions. There are some changes to the order or grouping or number of provisions, or I should say and number of provisions, which are now found under the core requirements. And there is also an R2 equipment categorization document which has been created, and we'll talk more about that later. There are no significant changes to the introduction portion in terms of comprehensiveness, legality of trade of electronics, conformity or applicability. The main change in the introduction section is the R2 equipment categorization document. A copy can be downloaded on Siri's website. I've included a link here. And the purpose of this document, or the intent, is to be used in conjunction with the standard to provide an outline of the requirements for evaluating electronic equipment and components, as well as categorizing the equipment and components based on their condition. So this information would have been taken out of the standard and put into this document in R2v3, or for R2v3. The categories identified in the REC either need to be incorporated into the R2 facilities processes and procedures, or be utilized via some type of cross-reference to link the requirements of the facility and the requirements of the REC. The R2 certification section, again, there are no significant changes to the auditability of related R2 documents, the application of the R2 code of practices, the R2 guidance, etc., or general auditing requirements. And again, revised versions of those documents will be published at some point after R2v3 is published. We don't have an exact timeline yet. R2 certificates will now list the process requirements that apply to each R2 facility, along with any applicable allowances as defined by the R2 code of practices. So that was already a requirement that the allowances be listed on the certificate, but now with R2v3 and the separation of the process requirements, the R2 certificates going forward from the publication of R2v3, or once you transition to R2v3, you'll also see those process requirements listed on your certificate. Definitely take a look at the definitions section of the R2v3 draft. I'm not going to take the time to go through all the definitions today, since you can review those on your own, but there are new or changed definitions for all of these terms, and I've sort of highlighted whether they're new, changed, or removed on this slide. Again, these slides will be available for download through PGR's website after the webinar today. A recording of the webinar will also be available in the next day or two on PGR's website. Okay, so we'll go through section by section. Section 1, the R2 core requirements, subsection scope, all processes at the R2 facility, as well as any external processes and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification, must be audited and certified to R2. And that's a direct quote, obviously, from the draft. This needs to include all core requirements found in section 1 and any applicable process requirements found in section 2, given the facility's scope of operations. So again, take a look at the draft. Take a look at how those two sections have been separated and the information in there as it applies to your organization. It's important to note that services outside of the facility but still related to a facility's operations may include off-site collection, mobile data destruction, any services performed at a customer's site, etc. Those are just a couple examples. So again, look at the draft and start thinking about what and how those requirements might apply to your organization. R2 facilities will now be required to publicly communicate a current and ongoing list of all other locations that are not certified to R2, are owned and or operated by the R2 facility, and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. Again, these are quotes pulled from the draft, and they may not be applicable to all of our R2 facilities. Not everyone owns multiple facilities, for example, but if this is applicable, you'll need to apply this as you transition to R2v3. For the core requirement 2, hierarchy of responsible management strategies, there are no significant changes because, again, the intent of the standard has not changed. Reuse is the primary goal, followed by recycling and limiting those what's the word I'm looking for? The types of management strategies that we don't want to see except in extreme situations like landfilling or something like that. So no changes here. Core requirement 3, the EHS management system requirements. The R2v3 draft recognizes ISO 45001, which will eventually replace OSAS 18001-2007. In the interim, both standards are interchangeable. Core requirement 3 requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances. I've included some examples here, such as mercury, lead, beryllium, based on the common ones for electronic equipment. It also requires that industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements be in place and maintained for high-risk activities such as materials recovery. So again, as you're reviewing the draft, take a look at these requirements to the extent that they apply to your organization and your processes. It specifies minimum accommodation and requirements on behalf of workers, such as safe drinking water, restroom facilities, preventing the consumption of food in areas that are not contaminant-free, things like that. Core requirement 4 focuses on legal and other requirements. The draft requires prompt corrective actions to address any compliance violations. R2 facilities will be required to notify their certification body, such as PJR, if they receive a notice of violation requiring action or follow-up from the issuing agency within 30 days. Child and forced labor is prohibited, and there are references within the standard to the relevant terms, but essentially it's referencing circumstances where workers cannot leave at will or terminate employment if they wish. So again, this is to the extent relevant to your organization. This will not be relevant to all facilities or industries. Prison labor is prohibited unless workers are compensated beyond room and board and are taught skills to be used to obtain employment upon release. So this is something new to R2. Specifies non-discrimination policy requirements and criteria. So those are found in core requirement 4. Core requirement 5 focuses on tracking throughput. The draft requires summary reports for all transactions and specifies what the contents of those required records are, such as accurate dates, detailed descriptions, and that would be for all inbound and outbound electronic equipment, components, and materials controlled by the R2 facility. A note on this requirement, the summary report has not been defined, but will likely require all inbound and outbound quantities within a defined reporting period. So we'll see how that changes once the final version is released, or if additional guidance is provided on that requirement. Total inventory levels must be maintained below the limit requirement to maintain conformity with the applicable legal requirements, the R2 facilities closure plan, etc. This core requirement also requires that equipment, components, or materials with a negative value not be stored for more than a year. The exception to this so far would be components which have been evaluated and inventoried per Appendix C, test and repair requirements. So keep an eye on how you'll implement that process, how you will identify what has a negative value, and whether it's been in your facility stored for getting close to a year. That's something to think about as you get ready to transition to R2 version 3. Core requirement 6 focuses on sorting, categorization, and processing. This section has been significantly restructured, so it's going to look a lot different. And again, it refers to the R2 equipment categorization document, the REC. Some of those requirements that would have been in the standard before have been pulled out and put into that separate document. This section requires a written process for the evaluation, sorting, and categorization of materials with prescribed subjects to be included within that process. Conformance to the hierarchy for requirement 2. Application of the REC categories for functionality, cosmetic condition, and data sanitization, identification of data storage devices, instructions for determination of the reuse potential based on condition, market value, and other relevant subjects, and any follow-up required when changing equipment categories. So this section is more prescriptive. You'll want to take a look at Core Requirement 6 based on the materials you process and how it affects your process to start thinking about how you'll implement those changes. Any equipment, components, or materials inbound from a non-R2 supplier is to be treated as non-functional and data-bearing and identified per the REC. So until you can prove otherwise, or until you've evaluated for yourself and against the REC, unless it's coming from an R2 supplier, we're assuming that it hasn't been tested and that it hasn't been data wiped. Continuing within Core Requirement 6, data evaluations are to include any connected user accounts. Identification requirements for equipment and components evaluated and found to be capable of reuse, as well as references to the applicable appendix requirements. So again, the theme here is that it's been restructured and there is more prescriptive requirements found here in Core Requirement 6 and in the REC. Equipment that is processed for a customer who directs the downstream disposition and is not owned by the R2 facility must be handled in accordance with Appendix F service only requirements. So if that is a process that is relevant to your organization, you'll want to take a look at Appendix F. Specific requirements for electronics or components evaluated and categorized as exempt equipment, such as handling them separately from controlled equipment, identification, justification for exemption, etc., can be found in Core Requirement 6 as well. So it's really specific in some areas, like I said, and more prescriptive. There are also specific requirements in Core Requirement 6 for transferring functioning products, equipment or components that demonstrated functionality according to the REC requirements, such as packaging requirements, unique identification for sale and shipping records, verification of shipment legality with documentation in a language understandable to the recycler, etc. So I've been trying to include some examples here to give you an idea of some of the key changes, some of the areas that you want to focus. All of this, again, is subject to change with the final version once it's published. Controlled equipment is defined within the REC in Table 1. It includes all equipment or material received by the R2 facility that has not yet been evaluated for functionality or reuse potential, as well as items that have been evaluated and determined to either be materials for recovery or equipment for test and repair. And that is quoted from the document. May be evaluated and determined to be exempt equipment, and you can see the relevant sections for more information on that. Physical labels are not necessarily required. You may also use barcodes or other means of identification or tracking. There's a lot of information included in Core Requirement 6, obviously. 7 focuses on data security. It requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with procedures to address subjects prescribed within the standard. So there's a lot of information here. Again, you'll want to reference the draft and start reviewing what that includes, or certainly start reviewing it once R2v3 is published to give yourself plenty of time to identify what changes are needed to your documentation and your controls and go ahead and implement those before you need to transition. Examples include, but are not limited to, the types of data storage devices accepted, general information that does not require sanitization, potential repopulation of data on devices, applicable contractual requirements as they may or may not apply to your organization, applicable legal and other requirements, and relevant policies or procedures to ensure conformance with those requirements, methods of sanitization, etc. Core Requirement 7 includes requirements for a written data security plan. The risk of theft and unauthorized access should be considered within the security program for the R2 facility. And core requirement 7 also requires levels of security permissions for controlled access, employees, visitors, contract workers, etc., relevant to the types of equipment received, the nature of data managed at the facility, legal and other requirements, etc., to be authorized by the data protection manager. So there are definitely some changes in R2v3, and it's good that we've got a staggered transition timeline to allow organizations to roll out those changes. Continuing with core requirement 7, written acknowledgements are to be maintained for those granted security authorization, addressing their individual responsibility to prevent the release of data, report theft, or data breaches. Core requirement 7 requires an incident response procedure for the investigation of potential or actual breaches of data or security, as well as to ensure the notification of regulators, suppliers, interested parties, and other relevant parties in the event of a potential or actual breach. Contracts are required to be used and enforced to ensure transporters adhere to relevant security controls when transporting data-bearing equipment or components. This is important for companies who outsource the data destruction activities or manage it in a similar way to make sure that those security controls are adhered to when you're essentially outsourcing that section of the standard to another organization. Security controls for transport of data-bearing products, such as concealing package contents, are also outlined in core requirement 7. Notifications to the supplier and record-keeping requirements associated with data-bearing equipment or components received are detailed in core requirement 7. Devices may be shipped or transferred for data destruction to an R2 certified downstream vendor per a written contract if in accordance with Appendix B, data sanitization, if the sanitization destruction is not being conducted by the R2 facility. So that means you can outsource the data sanitization processes if you are utilizing an R2 certified downstream vendor, have this written contract that meets the Appendix B requirements, things like that. So if that is relevant to your process, you're going to want to take a close look at all of the requirements outlined accordingly to make sure you've dotted all your I's to be able to ship and transfer the data-bearing media. Core requirement 7 also requires notifications to suppliers upon a change in downstream vendor when responsible for processing data-bearing equipment components from the supplier and when a security breach is identified, whether it is suspected or confirmed. Core requirement 8 is on the subject of focus materials. It requires demonstration of the recycling chain's expertise, capacity, planned methods, and capabilities needed to process focus materials on your behalf. Alkaline batteries not containing mercury would be managed under core requirement 2, hierarchy of responsible management strategies. Even lead-free circuit boards are considered focus materials. Those are some important items to highlight in core requirement 8. Core requirement 9, facility requirements, includes requirements such as indoor storage and labeling requirements, adequacy of insurance coverage given the risks and scope of the R2 facility's operations. So this would vary by facility, and needs to include changes in operations, changes in processing volumes, things like that. It includes requirements for closure plans, financial instruments, and insurance coverage, and those need to be disclosed to SERI. So that's a change. Exceptions for the requirement to hold a financial instrument for closure costs in the event of abandonment have also been identified within core requirement 9 in the draft version. So those exceptions include if the total closure costs are less than $10,000 US, If the size of all buildings owned, leased, or used by the R2 facility is less than 1,000 square meters, and if the R2 facility never accepts equipment, materials, or materials containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. So the exceptions are all of these, not one or two of these items. So to meet this exemption, you would have to meet all three of these bulleted points. Core requirement 10, transport requires the accuracy of codes, descriptions, and declarations in compliance with any applicable regulatory requirements for shipping documents and labels for transport. So moving to section 2, which is the process requirements, compared to section 1, which was the core requirements, we're looking at the appendices. Appendix A focuses on the downstream recycling chain. It outlines FM plan and due diligence requirements, including the verification of import and export legality for transboundary shipments. Import-export compliance evidence must be in a language understood by the recycler and the auditor. Verification of an R2 certificate validity will satisfy due diligence requirements. And Appendix A also requires transparent communication regarding the recycling chain to suppliers and SIRI. Appendix B, data sanitization, lists additions to be made to the data sanitization requirements of Core Requirement 7. So it supplements Core Requirement 7 with additional requirements in Appendix B. There are traceability requirements for each data storage device. There are training and competency requirements. Required security controls includes a physical destruction methods table be created and maintained by the organization, and requires the data protection manager verify the outputs of physical destruction, logical sanitization, and prescribed quality controls. Appendix C, test and repair. R2 facilities certifying to this process requirement are required to maintain certification to a quality management system, such as ISO 9001 or RIOS. So to apply Appendix C and maintain R2 certification for R2v3, including test and repair in the scope and on your certificate, you will need to have ISO 9001 or RIOS or some other type of quality management system. So that's a big change. Requires a written R2 reuse plan with prescribed criteria to be included, such as documented instructions, competency requirements, safety checks, functionality test plans, effectiveness verification plans, and return policy. Those are just a couple examples of some of those requirements. Appendix C includes a requirement to process materials within 1 year of receipt, and that would be tested, repaired, and or refurbished, or components are to be evaluated and inventoried as repair parts. Test result records are to be maintained for all functions for each uniquely identified item. Appendix B, specialty electronics reuse for facilities for whom this would be applicable. R2 facilities certifying to Appendix D, specialty electronics reuse process requirements must also be certified to Appendix C, test and repair, which we just discussed above. This appendix includes details of criteria and verifications required in lieu of testing for the specialty electronics if the R2 facility lacks the technical capability to test them. It requires the demonstration that customers accept the terms, lack of testing, for example, and will only sell directly to an end user with a free lifetime return policy. So again, there's really some prescriptive requirements here you're going to have to review in detail when you are ready to transition your system. Appendix E, materials recovery. There are additional EHS requirements for R2 facilities performing materials recovery related activities, such as shredding beyond the shredding of hard drives, breaking, cutting, melting, chemical processing, etc. For focus materials. So again, the way this is set up is any appendices that are applicable to your organization would get tacked on, listed on the certificate, included in your audit. So these won't all be relevant for all R2 facilities. You don't have to be certified to all of the appendices to maintain R2 V3 certification or obtain that. Obviously, not all companies perform materials recovery activities. This would only be applied, this appendix would only be applied for facilities who do materials recovery activities. Appendix F is service only. This applies to services performed for a customer while the R2 facility does not own the equipment and the customer dictates the downstream vendors to be used. It must process such equipment and materials and send downstream within 3 months of receipt, unless storage is part of the contract with the customer, and storage of negative value equipment must be 1 year or less. Downstream vendors are to be included and managed per Appendix A, downstream recycling chain, and contract criteria and record keeping requirements are identified within Appendix F as well. So again, Appendix F won't be applicable to all organizations, but if this is within your scope, then you would apply Appendix F and those requirements would be relevant. Appendix G, brokering, applies to the sourcing of equipment or components without physically receiving or processing them in the R2 facility. Focus materials are transported directly to the downstream vendor or end user. So they're never actually going to the R2 facility who is pursuing certification, and that's when Appendix G would apply. Downstream vendors are to be included and managed according to Appendix A. R2 facilities certifying to this process requirement are required to maintain certification to a quality management system such as ISO 9001 or RIOS. And Appendix G satisfies the insurance and closure cost financial instrument requirements of Core Requirement 9, as well as the EHS requirements of Core Requirement 3. We'll take a quick overview or high-level look at the R2 equipment categorization document, the REC, really quick, and then we will move on. The framework for evaluating equipment and categorization, categorizing its R2 condition throughout each step of the R2 process. That is the intent of the document. It supplies categories for cosmetic condition, functional condition, data sanitization status, to be used for electronics and components either individually or in batches, to be used from the receiving process all the way through post-processing activities. Preferably, the R2 facility will utilize these exact categories, but it's also acceptable to cross-reference their existing categorization system with those outlined in the REC. So again, an R2 facility can either utilize the REC's categories exactly as found in the document, or supply a cross-reference linking their current process to the requirements of the REC. Not all categories will apply to all R2 facilities. Only relevant categories are expected to be used and implemented. Categories do not replace descriptions required for contracts, regulatory compliance, etc. Let's see, additional non-mandatory categories will be listed in the R2 guidance document once that is published. Common equipment categorization tables. Equipment is assumed to be non-functioning unless or until testing effectively demonstrates functionality. We covered that earlier. Functioning equipment is not subject to downstream due diligence requirements. That is the same as R2 2013. Specific equipment categorization. This section is currently blank. SERI may adopt alternative categories as needed in the future, is the note there. Appendix A of the REC focuses on enhanced cosmetic category information ranging from CO, which is not categorized or evaluated yet, through C9, which is new items in an open box. Appendix B, linkage with functioning, cosmetic, and data sanitization categories. This is used for finished goods, processed and ready for reuse sale. Okay, I went through those pretty quickly because, again, this is a draft version of the standard, and I want to have time for questions at the end. So really quickly, for anyone who is not currently certified or not familiar with the certification process, if you would be pursuing certification to R2V3 and you want to know what that process looks like, the first step would be to download the standard. Obviously, R2V3 only has the draft available at this time. The R2 document library is where the R2V3 final version will be available, so I've also included a link there. But the first step for pursuing certification to any standard would be to download the standard itself. Then you'll need to establish the environmental health and safety management system documentation required by R2V3, conduct training to meet those requirements, implement the requirements of the management system, including conducting an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and a review of the system based on those two inputs, a management review type review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. And then you'll complete a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit, both of those two types of audits. Address any nonconformities that result from the stage 2 audit, and then you would be issued a certificate. So the certification process, as I said, consists of 2 audits. The stage 1 is a documentation review to make sure the framework is in place from a documentation standpoint and that you're ready to move on to stage 2. The stage 2 is usually 1 to 2 months after the stage 1. It's a full system audit of the implementation and the effectiveness of the system in meeting requirements of the standard. Any nonconformities issued at stage 2 would need to be resolved before a certificate could be issued. After a certificate is issued, it's good for 3 years. You would be on a surveillance cycle with either semi-annual or annual audits, depending on the contract and the client's preference, and those represent partial system audits. Unlike the stage 2, we wouldn't cover every single process, every audit, but a sampling of those processes. There are processes that get audited every year, but overall it is a partial system audit, followed by, on the 3rd year, the recertification audit, which is similar to the stage 2. It's a full system audit and it results in the issuance of a new certificate, and that 3-year cycle starts again. Okay, again, I went through this very quickly for 2 reasons. I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end, and also it is a draft. So these slides will be updated as we have more information. The R2V3 final version could be substantially different from this. We are basing this webinar and slides on the information that we have so far. So if you haven't already, please type your questions into the question field and we will take time to review those now. And while I do that, I'm just going to put our contact information up on the screen in case anyone has questions that they'd like to talk about offline, if you find you have questions down the road, or if you have more technical type things you want to discuss. So Stacy DeSantis is our EHS program manager. I've included the main PGR phone number and Stacy's email address. I can also be reached through the main PGR number, and here's my email address if you'd like to chat more after the webinar. If you are looking for a quote, I've also included the sales department phone number to go ahead and get that process started. Okay, so let's see. One question we have: during the webinar, we were disconnected due to internet problems on our end. Will it be possible to obtain the overheads showing changes on core requirements 1 through 3? So as I mentioned, the slides will be available for download through PGR's website after the webinar today, within the next day or 2, as will be a recording of today's webinar. Again, within the next day or 2, you can access those through PGR's website. So anything you might have missed, you can get caught up on that way. I'll hang on here for any other questions. that was all the questions I saw so far. Someone does have their hand raised. If you have a question, you can go ahead and type it in, or sometimes I know people bump that hand raising by mistake. So either go ahead and type your question in or shoot me an email or give me a call. It looks like that is all the questions we have so far for today. So thank you for joining us this morning for our R2 version 3 draft webinar. Again, we will continue to offer these webinars as well as other subjects, and I'll keep the slides updated as additional revised drafts are released and as the final version is published and as more information is made available. So good luck with your transition and have a great day.